I'm Ellen Harpel, founder and president of Business Development Advisors.
Lisa Sturtevant, Associate Research Professor at the School of Public Policy and Deputy Director at the Center for Regional Analysis at George Mason University.
I'm Erik Pages, President of EnterWorks Consulting, an economic development consulting firm here in Arlington. Please join us in conversation. What we're going to talk about today is what works in economic development. Here in Virginia, we have a gubernatorial election going on now, and we've got the Republican Ken Cuccinelli and the Democrat Terry McAuliffe, both running on a platform of economic development. Who's going to be best in terms of creating jobs in Virginia and in communities across Virginia? Most of the time, not just here in Virginia, but anywhere across the U.S., we find that it's really more rhetoric than reality in terms of what the candidates say they're going to do about creating jobs. What we want to do is to dig down into the reality today and talk about what it takes for communities to be successful in terms of economic development and what separates a community that's being very productive and prosperous from those that are not being as successful in economic development. So let me turn it over to you, Ellen, to get us started.
Well, one of the interesting things about economic development is that what works in one place doesn't necessarily work every place. Every place has its unique assets, its features, its objectives. So what I love about working in this field is that every place is different. You can't just take one approach and apply it everywhere. But some of the key things that almost every community needs is a solid workforce and workforce development, good education, different types of real estate assets, both on the commercial and industrial side, but also on the housing side. And you need good economic development programs from in the Economic Development Office, but also with our partner organizations. And I think one of the most underappreciated assets that a community has, or too many communities don't have, is dedicated leadership that can focus on a set of economic development strategies that make sense for their community over the long term. So often it is politically driven, and that doesn't make sense. And I think one of the reasons Virginia has been successful is, despite who's has served as governor or lieutenant governor, they've been pretty consistent in how they do economic development at the state level. And I think that's true here in Arlington as well. And I think it's one of the underappreciated economic development assets that we have here.
Yeah, I think leadership is incredibly important. I think that, when I want to get back to one of the other things that Ellen mentioned was about workforce. And I feel like when you talk to firms and why they come to a certain place, the availability of an educated workforce, a skilled workforce, folks who are trained in the areas that are in demand, this availability of a workforce is critically important. So I think when we think about economic development and we think about how communities try to attract businesses, I think thinking also about how communities attract a workforce is also critically important. And so when there's different tools about attracting businesses, retaining businesses, I think less talked about in economic development circles is strategies to attract and retain a workforce. Right. And I'm thinking about things like housing, things like planning policies that make a place somewhere that people want to be. When you think about housing, if you are a worker and you're trying to figure out where you want to be, the availability of affordable housing, the availability of housing that suits your needs and your family's needs, that's critical to where you decide to move. And so often over the last decade or two, people have decided where to move and firms have followed those educated workers. And so in my mind, if a community wants to be successful in attracting businesses, they need to think about how to attract this workforce. And making sure there's housing that's affordable to that workforce is critically important.
Yeah, I think there's been kind of a big change. I mean, if you wanted to put it in a bumper sticker, the place with the most talent wins. And that's a big change from the way we used to think about doing economic development. And even 5-10 years ago, if you said what is kind of the classic win in economic development, it's the ribbon cutting or the gold shovel where they're digging in the ground and the big plan is going to go up. Yeah. That's changed now. It really is. What does your community have? Do you have the ingredients that people that are smart and talented and creative, do they want to come there? Do they want to live there? Do they want to visit there? And having those kinds of things, it makes economic development much more complicated than just the gold shovel or the ribbon cutting that we have in the past. But that's really what matters for economic development nowadays.
Well, I agree, and I think the main point is how much more complicated it has become, and which is good because we've recognized the complexity of how you make an economy prosper. It isn't just about business attraction. But I don't think we can just ignore the business development part of it either, because people come to, especially this region, because there are jobs here.
Right.
So it's not just you do one and then the other happens. They really have to happen in tandem, or they feed into each other. So you can't just have a place or a workforce development policy without thinking about the business side of it.
No, I think that's right. And I think in this region, particularly in the Washington area and in Arlington, with what's going on with changes in federal spending, and the fact that our economy has been so reliant on federal spending, both payroll spending with the federal government workforce, but also procurement spending, that is the spending of federal dollars on private sector goods and services. As that piece shrinks here in the Washington area, and it is going to shrink, whether it's through sequestration or whether it's over a longer period of time, the presence of the federal government is going to be smaller, and there's going to be a greater need for the private sector to step in. And I think that's something that's critically important for Arlington.
Right, and that's actually been an issue for us here in the Washington area. We've been blessed to be the center of the federal government. But again, really until quite recently, we really did not have a lot of homegrown businesses in the Washington, D.C. area. And I think that's something that, again, is something different and new in economic development, is the importance of small business development and entrepreneurship. Every community has entrepreneurs in it. And so the community, their ability to help people start businesses and to help people grow those businesses so that they create a lot of jobs, that is a real, again, another mind shift in economic development. It's not just about bringing businesses in, it's what can you do to grow businesses in your community.
Well, and I think on this entrepreneurship side, I think it's really interesting. I'm curious to think how you guys think about this, but there's been some folks who say that this reduction in federal spending might actually be a really great benefit for the region. So that some of the folks who are very entrepreneurial and very smart and very inventive may be working right now within the federal government, because the federal government can be a really exciting place to work. But as that sector declines, these people may go out and become entrepreneurs and may become small business owners and may sort of encourage that in the private sector. And I don't know to the extent that's true.
That's a pretty, that's a story that happens all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, here in Washington area, a lot of the technology businesses, the people that run them came from MCI or they came from America Online or those kinds of companies. So the federal government could clearly do that. In fact, you look at Silicon Valley, if you look at the long history of Silicon Valley going all the way back to the late 1950s, almost every company in Silicon Valley can trace its heritage back to 8 people that left a company called Fairchild Semiconductor in 1958. That included Andy Grove, who started Intel, some of the first venture capitalists that funded Apple Computer. Almost every technology company in Silicon Valley can trace itself back to that. So that's not at all unusual to have that kind of history where companies spin off. And so in fact, that's the upside of bad news often in economic development.
Well, and I think we've seen some of that happen in the Washington area already over time because if you look at long-term trends, the federal government has been shrinking for a long time. I mean, there was definitely in the last decade, it had started to increase again. But through both outsourcing and kind of changes in the way the federal government does business, we have such a very large professional services sector here that has never stopped growing. Even during the recession, we always added jobs in the professional services sector. And it's so much bigger than the federal government sector. So I don't know if you can trace it to individuals, so it's not as exciting of a story, but you can definitely trace the provenance of these companies from this outsourcing and kind of spitting out of the federal sector and then serving the federal sector. And so I think the really exciting question for our region now is how much more can the sector grow independent of what happens in the federal sector. In theory, they are very well positioned to grow because they are not locked into one federal agency. They can, all the innovation and ideas that they have, they can share with partners, with other customers, all around the world. And so I think it will be very exciting to follow it over the next few years to see exactly how well we do, because we should be able to do well just for these very reasons, and we'll see if it actually happens.
I think that's true. And what I'm curious about too is how each of the individual jurisdictions in the region operate. We operate as a region, right? Because we have a lot of assets that are regional, a workforce, we have transportation infrastructure, we have investment, but each individual community is competing against one another for business. And I wonder if to what extent that is a good thing, and I think it is a good thing, in a lot of ways. But do we often lose out? When Maryland's competing against Virginia, they're two very different states. So when Fairfax and Montgomery County come to the table and try to recruit businesses, they're coming with very different state support.
Right.
And I wonder how that plays out.
Yeah, and that's, again, something I think that's changed quite a bit in economic development is the importance of regions. But, I mean, again, it's difficult for, Arlington County or Fairfax County or Washington, D.C. to embrace regionalism if it means that the business is going to go somewhere else or the jobs are going to go somewhere else. But again, I think the one thing we do need to recognize is businesses don't make a distinction really between Arlington or DC or Fairfax or Montgomery County. They think of the Washington metropolitan area. And so to the extent that we're able to do that, we need to sort of act the way businesses act. But again, that's often harder to do if you're the mayor of DC and a business goes to Fairfax and you say that's okay.
Right.
That's, your constituents aren't going to necessarily agree with that.
Right.
That's right. Although there should be ways, because the reason that there are these imperatives for the local groups to act the way they are is because of the fiscal impacts.
Yeah. Right.
But if you can get people to understand the overall project benefits that come to the region because of the nature of the jobs or the way it supports one of our core industries, and then of course people commute all over the place. So there are jobs that might be in one location, but the people that have those jobs go back to their home jurisdictions and spend the money. So if you can talk about the economic impact, which always benefits the region, it's never localized. It's just the fiscal impact that's localized. So perhaps to the extent people are willing to talk about this other piece or value it as much as they value the fiscal impact, which is tough for a politician because of course that's really the main thing that they're tasked with shepherding, is their budget and their fiscal situation. But there should be ways to tell this bigger story to get over that problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, what happens oftentimes is there is a narrow issue that gets focused on, and you mentioned the fiscal issue. I also think about workforce attraction, and I feel like there's often a very narrow focus on attracting this young group. Maybe it's because I'm not young anymore, so I feel fancy about it. The fact that there's this real strong emphasis on attracting the Gen Y, right? The echo boomers, and doing things that conform to what we think they want. Right. And I wonder if that's a smart economic development strategy, because this is a group of people who are very well educated and are relatively large when you compare it to Gen X. But they are also in a period of transition in their life, and they're going to move into different jobs and move into different life areas, cycles of their life. And I feel like that by planning too much for folks who are in their 20s, that maybe economic development folks and housing folks, frankly, might be missing the boat.
Yeah, I've seen the flip side when I worked in communities, particularly in the southern part of the United States, that try to attract retirees to move there. And in fact, they sort of look at that and they say, this is a free lunch for us because we've got people that they don't use the schools, they don't use many of the services, but they're wealthy and they pay a lot of taxes, which makes sense when a person's in their late 50s or their early 60s and they're relatively healthy. But what happens when they get to their 70s and 80s? They're less mobile, and they need very expensive and sophisticated healthcare services. So again, I think it's not just the Gen Y; it's even the boomers and beyond in terms of thinking about that. I think it kind of gets back to this issue: is that you want to create diversity in your community, not just traditional diversity that's racial diversity that we think of, things like that, but in terms of your age of your population, the kind of industries you have there. That's going to create a more competitive and resilient place.
Right. And this is one of the key words that we keep hearing more about flexibility and resilience in your economy. And that's right. If you're focused on one piece of it or another, then you're not nearly as able to adapt to the changes that come along, because they will come along. So.
And the economic diversity argument is really interesting to me as well. And I think that when I talk to people about the need for housing in their community, a lot of folks need to hear the case for affordable housing, right? They need to understand why they should care about having housing that's affordable at all. And because if you have high-end housing, you get lots of tax revenue, isn't that great? But this idea of having a diverse workforce and having a diverse economy, I don't know what the research says about this, but intuitively, places that have a diverse economic base seem more resilient, and that if you only have this end or you only have this end, those are not the places that seem like they're very successful.
Or a place necessarily that you really, that has a good feel to it, that you want to live in, that's just a kind of a Beverly Hills, or on the flip side, a very distressed community. I mean, you want a place that's got a mix of uses and a mix of activities going on.
Yeah, that's right.
I want to follow up on a point, kind of connecting points that each of you made, which is about young people versus people of all ages. And a lot of people have the impression that it's more young people who are entrepreneurs and who start companies. And then we talked about the role of entrepreneurship and how economic development as a whole has done a better job of supporting new businesses and growing existing businesses. And so one of the questions I've had is this recent focus on gazelles, whether these, perceived potentially high growth firms are really the right way to focus economic development resources. And I don't know about the ages, but I think of them as being, people think of them as being started by younger entrepreneurs, and that this is really a place where resources are being focused, and whether that's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important question going on now. So these gazelle businesses are businesses that grow very fast, 15, 20% per year. Sometimes they're in technology, but they can be in any kind of activity. And we're trying to make a distinction between startups, and most businesses start small and they stay very small. And then these gazelle businesses start small and grow very quick. So I think Google is kind of the quintessential gazelle businesses, but there's hundreds of thousands of gazelle businesses here in Arlington right now. But believe it or not, most of those businesses are started by older people. I mean, the average age is about 40 for a gazelle business owner when they started. And again, we think of kind of the Facebook founder, Jeff Zuckerberg, as kind of the exception that proves the rule. He's so unique that he started that when he was 18. Most of them, most gazelle business owners are older because you just think about it. You need to understand an industry. You have to have connections. You got to have knowledge. Well, if you're 21 years old, you don't have that necessarily. You just haven't had the time to build that. So it's people that are older tend to be more likely to be gazelles. The other thing that we know about gazelles is that they're often immigrants. They come here from other countries, and so to the extent that we are open to immigrants, particularly immigrants with skills, coming here, that's another way to really help sort of seed economic growth.
And I don't know if this was your question, but does it make sense to try and identify these gazelle businesses and that's where you should put the resources, or to the like sort of setting aside some other kinds of businesses? I mean, is that?
Yeah, that's the question I get every time from my from our firm's clients. Ideally, you would identify the gazelles in advance and put the resources there. But if you would do that, you might as well be a venture capitalist or a banker, right? If you could do that, you would do it, right? If you could predict what companies are going to succeed. So it's very difficult to predict in advance which ones are going to be successful and which are not. We kind of know, certain industries and certain kinds of backgrounds. But even then, it's a bit of a crapshoot. And so, I've always advocated that you need to help all businesses, and the cream will rise to the top. And there's nothing wrong with a person starting a business and being self-employed, and that's it, because they're paying taxes, they're not on the welfare rolls, and they're contributing to the community. That's fine too. If they're going to be a gazelle business, that's great as well. But I mean, all kinds of businesses bring important assets to the community.
Right, I agree, and I think sometimes in economic development, it's tough because they have only so many resources and number of experts on their staff. They have to pick and choose, and sometimes it's they just want to focus on attracting young talent, or sometimes okay, we're really focused on gazelles right now. But I think you're right; it's really more important if they can and kind of draw on broader community resources to provide the whole range of services. And I do worry about the focus on gazelles exclusively, because it can devolve into let's place a bet on a couple of small companies, and it's a very high risk maneuver for a community then to take that approach.
And you mentioned community resources, and here in Arlington, I think that we're getting this this concentration of higher educational resources. So George Mason is now the School of Public Policy, and the law school are here in Arlington. We have Virginia Tech, we have Marymount, we have GW has a location here. And I feel like there's so much potential to capitalize on the stuff that's going on in our universities. In a place like when I think about that, how that works, I think more like out in Prince William County, the campus of George Mason out there, where they have labs and they have research space and they have the innovation center, where it was put out there for that reason, to turn academic research into private sector business. And I feel like there's more opportunities here in Arlington to be taken advantage of, I think, in that way. And a place like Prince George's County, where College Park is, I feel like there's so many untapped opportunities to take advantage of, as you said, community resources like universities and these kinds of places.
I've always thought that the Center for Regional Analysis is really at the vanguard of doing this for a university, and if other disciplines within universities had the same outward focus and communication orientation that you all do. I mean, to me, that's the model, and not just for economic development, though it is a model for economic development as well, but just this whole attitude of we talk a lot to a lot of people, and we do research that people are interested in, and other researchers are focused in their department or just in their discipline, but the more you have an ethos, I guess, of this speaking out.
Yeah, well, and the way the university is changing. I mean, the university is becoming much more outwardly focused, particularly George Mason or in this area, but all sorts of places are being more engaged with the community, engaged with the private sector. And I think there's real opportunities there on the economic development front.
Yeah, I think that's a big, exciting change. I mean, I used to call it the magic beanstalk theory. The college universities, they'd have a patent or they'd have some new technology and say, here it is, come get it, and get
make
rich on this, make money on it. Well, it's not that easy, right? So you gotta, it really is a contact sport. You gotta be out there and have regular interactions with people and discussions, and people have to feel comfortable coming onto the college campus or interacting with people on the college campus. And on the flip side, the university researchers have to speak plain English to people. And so sort of creating those kinds of connections is really important. And it's starting to happen now, finally.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that when you think about everything that, if we bring it back to Arlington, Arlington is in a little bit of a challenging period with losing so many jobs to BRAC and having a lot of office vacancies, or what they're looking at. And what are the things that can promote the aspects of Arlington that make them more competitive? There's sort of comparative advantages, and I think the universities is certainly one. I think access to Washington, access to Metro, access to different places like that. But those kinds of things that economic development professionals. I mean, what's most important right now, would you think, to a place like Arlington to promote?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is this issue of entrepreneurship and kind of helping people pursue their own ventures. I mean, I think that's very important. We talked about gazelle businesses. The other big change we have is the independent workforce. People that are consultants. I'm an independent worker. Ellen is an independent worker as well. The sense that we have businesses, but we're really sort of freelancers to a certain extent. That's very common nowadays. And you get in many parts of the United States, it's about a third of the workers in the community are what are called 1099ers. That refers to the tax. We receive a 1099 form when you get paid at the end of the year. And so that independent part of the workforce is big and it's growing. And what do those kind of people need? They need help to grow their businesses with financing. They need networking opportunities. They need places where they can interact with other independent workers. So, co-work spaces and things like that. We're starting to see that in Arlington. That's very, very important because they need to be able to build those connections to do business with one another.
And I think those same things are what will drive success at the macro level too. This whole idea of networking and communication and access. The more you are connected to all sorts of business and opportunities and partners around the world, the more valuable your community is and the better off you are. And that can be even air transportation. If you have a hub that connects to all different parts of the world, that creates opportunities that other communities aren't going to have. Certainly good telecommunications obviously is a must-have for everyone. But just the idea of people coming and going too, I think is what separates a really dynamic and prosperous community from one that's just got its own little economy and it only thinks about itself. That community is not poised for success. So a place like Arlington in the greater Washington region, I think, has all of those assets.
No, I think so, and I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. And we talked a little bit about competing, places competing, and when we look at where there's a lot of economic growth forecast in the region, it's really the Dulles Corridor, it's Tysons, it's Merrifield. It is not necessarily Arlington, and it's interesting to think Arlington was kind of the place to go because it was the first with Metro, right? It was the first with that great access, and it was the first with the development that came around Metro. And now as as firms are looking for where to be in Northern Virginia, everyone's talking about the Silver Line, everyone's talking about Tysons, and when there's sort of a limited amount of sort of that kind of business, I think this growing on its strengths like this and thinking about what it can provide that that is new, I think is really important for Arlington. We can't provide transit anymore. We already have it, but it has to be something new, and we talked about that.
And that's we're we're more of an urban space
Right.
now than a suburban
Right.
place as we were 20, 25 years ago in Arlington.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But part of that is those other places will grow because they're starting from a smaller
Sure.
base. And
Right.
so I think that's important to remember too.
Sure.
I don't see Arlington truly losing competitiveness, from where I sit, although these other places will become more competitive. But I don't think that necessarily means that Arlington loses,
Well, remember, we're talking about regionalism here, so we're happy
Right,
to
right. So it does, right. So we all win, right?
That's I think that's,
Yeah.
yes, we do.
Right, that's
So.
right. Well, that's really interesting. And you're doing a lot now with incentives and how incentives work to help bring economic development to a community.
Right. The use of incentives has always been part of economic development, and
Like
these
what
are
kinds of incentives are these?
tax breaks
Okay.
for different types of businesses. Some are just grants for different types of activities. Sometimes they're grants for just creating jobs. Sometimes it's grants to help pay for workforce training. But the real story is the way that incentive use has grown tremendously over the past couple of years. A New York Times article estimated it at about $80 billion a year, though nobody really knows how much it truly is. And Virginia alone had $90 million worth of grants, just grants last year, 2011. So while use has really expanded, as we talked about before, the resources for economic development professionals have declined. And so while a lot more businesses are coming asking for incentives and programs have grown to offer incentives, the economic development offices are kind of behind in terms of being able to match and really stay on a level playing field with the companies that are coming to them. So we've been doing a lot of work on providing tools and data. It's kind of, I feel like we're at the Moneyball point of incentive use. You know, we know that we've been making decisions kind of based on our gut and not a lot of good data and analysis. And I think that we're at the point where we can move forward with better data, better analytical tools to enable better decision making. And so that's something that I've been working on to focus on. How do you know if you're dealing with a good company? What tools do you look at to know if this is a good deal for your community? Can you monitor compliance over time and things like that?
So what do you see, though? Do you think that companies are more interested in help with workers or help with financing and taxes and things like that?
I think it's really hard to walk away from cash. So,
Fair enough.
so if there's cash, that's pretty exciting to people. But I think if you look at it from the economic development side, and the company side, I think workforce-related grants and programs are the best used and highly valued on both sides. So I think workforce is the area.
But I think, one thing that I think is very interesting is, it's clear that companies are attracted to incentives, and they take incentives into account when they are looking at moving to a different location or things like that, or relocating.
Yes.
But I think the interesting thing related to that, what's pretty clear now is that a community's tax structure doesn't really have as big an impact in economic development as people think. A lot of times people always say, well, if you're the cheapest place, you have the lowest taxes, you provide free land or free services, you're going to win in terms of economic development. That's actually not the case. The taxes make some impact on business decisions, but they're much more interested in other things, whether it's the quality of housing or the quality of life, schools. That's much more important than having a low tax rate.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's a bit of a change.
I think that's true, and it's true as businesses are focused on growth, because then they're looking at those other factors which support growth, whereas the tax factors are more in a mature industry where you're really focused on managing costs. They're different types of businesses, and so if you are a community that wants to attract these growing businesses and look to your future prosperity, then these are the kinds of things that you need to focus on.
And I think this gets to something that you talked about at the beginning, that economic development is not done in isolation anymore. So this, as it's done at the government level, you're sort of bringing in agencies from all across the government. You're bringing in professional organizations from across the community.
Absolutely.
You're bringing in citizen groups to understand that you're sort of making a place as well as simply bringing firms in. I think that's definitely been different.
Right. And I think that's a very important thing we might close on, is that this is really about making a place, not about bringing in jobs directly necessarily.
Right.